Good day, folks. Welcome back to the channel. We're going to start a new series today. I know we're in the middle of the Regional Rails series, and that's going to continue. But I wanted to get a series started on the provider package because I've been using it a lot lately, and every time I use it, I like it more, and I just see more potential with it. And there are some 15-20 minute tutorials out there that cover kind of the basics, somewhat parallel the examples on pub.dev. But don't really cover the scenarios that you actually run into as a developer. So I want to do a series where we tackle a different type of provider with every video. We build around an app, so we're using real-world scenarios. And I'm going to start with Change Notifier Provider, which is a provider that allows you to kind of tell the widget tree when something has changed. So this is not a stream or a feature where something is kind of coming down through the stream or after a feature is resolved. You've made a change and you want to tell the UI this has changed, refresh everything in the UI that is listening to this particular piece of data. So a very handy provider to have, and something very handy to have for your tool belt. So we're going to cover those different types of providers in this series. We'll cover different ways to bring in the provider to your widget. We'll cover things like multi-provider. Really going to try to dig through the documentation and cover what's there because I think it's time for a soup to nuts video series on the provider package. So that's the objective. We'll start with Change Notifier Provider today and we'll go from there. So hope you join me. Here we go. Okay, and so in thinking of an app that might work for this entire series, I came up with kind of a goofy one, and I've created it. It's called wax app _. So I've created it by typing Flutter create wax _app. And I'm a Nordic skier. Every time I go to a Nordic ski center, everybody's talking about the conditions and the kind of wax that they used. And so this app is going to have a home page that streams this information as if people are inputting it into their own app, and it's streaming to me the temperature out there and what kind of wax they're using. We are going to have a settings page that will allow us to set, or allow the user to set the units to imperial or metric. And then we will have a filter chip row that will allow them to select the brand of waxes that they want to see. There's multiple brands, and some people only work with one or two. And then we'll have a login function that will allow us to have a feature. We'll make a call out to a provider and get a response back with a feature. And the reason I picked that is that not because the world needs it, but because it's a nice way to demonstrate different kinds of providers. And so what I got on my screen here, if you can picture this is the widget tree here. Really simplified widget tree, but we've got an app, we've got a home screen with a scaffold and widgets on it. We've got an app, we've got a settings with a scaffold and some widgets on it as well. And I've inserted at these various points different providers in the widget tree. And this is what we're going to do with our providers. And today we're going to insert this one, which will be a Change Notifier Provider, and we're going to set up the settings class. And the way to think about providers is you are essentially creating a bridge between your widget tree and your data classes. So when you put a provider in the widget tree, it is very minimal, but what it does is connect to your data class and allow any widget below, and that's important, any widget below that provider to go up the tree to the provider and jump over to the class, which is a single instance of that class. So when you set a string and you call for it down here in the center of the scaffold, it goes up to provider, it goes over to the single instance of the class and gets that string. And when you set it, it does the same thing. It goes up to the provider and gets that single instance of the setting. So that's the way to think about provider. The reason I've set this app up this way is that then we can have a provider that is a future provider for the auth. We can have a stream provider for the wax class. And so by structuring it this way, it allows us to work in a bunch of different kinds of providers, which is all I'm trying to do in this app. All right. So over here in our app, we're going to open up the lib. We will go to main.dart and do what we do at the beginning of most projects is to clean this demo app up. So first of all, we'll take out this big block of code. I am going to change the title. We'll do a little bit here. I don't want to do too much with styling, but let's at least, we'll call it Wax App. We'll leave, let's see. Okay, no, we won't leave the primary swatch. Let's change the primary swatch to color deep orange. And we'll set an accent color. And like I said, we're not going to do much, but let's just do the rough outlines of a real app. Let's do deep orange accent, and up here I meant to do deep purple. All right, now let's go down here and let's just get rid of this everything from class my homepage down, including the curly braces. Get them out of there. And that will temporarily break our app. That's okay. Let's also go to lib and let's add a new folder, and let's add the screens that we're going to need. So we'll add screens folder, and inside the screens folder we will create home.dart and settings.dart. So those are the two screens that we'll work with today. Going to home, we will just do class home extends stateless widget, and we will let autocomplete do our build method for us. Get rid of that comment. All right, so in home we want a scaffold. We want an app bar. And on that app bar, we're going to put a title, and it is going to be a text that says Wax App. Super fancy. And we do also want actions. So in our actions, we're going to have an icon button. And the icon is going to be icons. We want the wheel. There we go, settings. And then we want an onPress method, which for now will be blank, but we want this to take us over to our settings page when it's done. So I will save that. I am going to format that. And then we will go to settings page. We'll do class settings extends stateless widget. Let autocomplete do the build method. Get rid of this green there. And we're going to build a scaffold. I'm just going to scratch out enough so the screen looks somewhat readable. And we'll do an app bar, and we will give the app bar a title, which will be a text widget, which will say settings. All right, so let's come back to main and let's just fix our error. Let's do home, and we need to import the home widget. Okay. Let's get this running. Before we do, let's bring in our packages. So let's go to pubspec.yaml. Sorry. Go there on the app, and in our browser, go to pub.dev. And the packages I want to use are provider, of course. So we're going to bring that one in. So we'll search that. Go to installing, get the version. Bring that right below Cupertino icons, paste it in, and save, and let Visual Studio Code do the rest. Now, while we're here, I want to grab one more package. So if we come back to pub.dev, I want to grab the shared preferences package. And so we go to installing, we grab this line here, we take it over to pubspec.yaml, put it in there. Great. And the reason I want to grab that is when we set our settings in our state, I want to preserve those settings so that when our state is destroyed, we can get them back. Okay, I'm going to come to main.dart and I am going to start my emulator. All right, and while we wait for that, since we now have a settings page to go to, let's come back to home. Let's revisit our onPress method on this icon button. And now we can direct this to the settings page. So when this fires up, we can go to the settings page and view it as we start to build it. So let's do navigator.ofContext. We will push it. So we're going to push a material page route. We need a builder, context. It goes to settings. I finally got that whole thing memorized. Nice. Okay, so while that has not yet come up yet, so let's go to settings and let's start to build that page. And when it pops up, we can pull it up on our emulator and see what we're building. But for now, we have an app bar on our settings page, and what I'd like to do is have a couple of rows on the settings page. The first one, I want to have a label and a drop down that contains the units, imperial or metric. And then in the second row, I want to have some filter chips with the different brands of wax. I'm going to do Swix and Toco that you can check or uncheck to add to the list of brands that you would want to see on the main page. So we need body. And in that body, I want to do a column. So we'll do a column, and then we'll do 2 rows inside the column. We'll have children, and I'm going to format here. Give myself some space in the children. We have the Wax app on the screen, so we've got this here. We've got settings. Hopefully that takes us, the wheel takes us over to settings, and it does. And so I'm going to have this page up while we build this so we can see what we're doing. All right, so the first row that I want to have, so let's do a row. We'll have children. So like I said, label to the left, drop-down box to the right. So let's do text, units, and then we will do a drop-down button of type string. Open up our parentheses. I'm going to hit space and enter so I can go to the next line. The value, I'm just going to set this for now. We're going to hard code it to Swix. And then on changed, we need a function, and I'm just going to do, actually we're going to get a string out of that, so we do need to at least tell it that. String value. I'm just going to just put a to do there because this is where we want to, not Swix, I'm sorry. Let's do imperial because this is the units. Update units. So this is where we need to come back. When we have our provider set up, this is where the widget is going to interact with it. All right, so below our onChanged, we have a drop-down button, so we need to set it up with some options. So let's do items, property, and we will give it an array type string. So we will do string, some brackets here, and our options will be imperial or metric. And on that bracket, we want to map this because we need a drop-down menu item made out of those strings. So it's a drop-down menu item of string. This actually should be that sign, and then this should be a double there. Double closure. Okay, good. And inside here, we want two parentheses, a string value. And then after this parenthesis here, we want to open up some curly braces for a function. And in here, we want to return drop-down menu item type string. And our properties, we will have a value of the value from right up here, and a child of a text widget that is the text widget that contains the value. All right, so we need a, nope, no semicolon there. All right. Semicolon here. And then we have a curly brace, a parenthesis. Right after that, we want to cast this to a list. And I got one too many parentheses in here. All right, let me format that and I'll let you look at it for a second. Immensely complicated to create a drop-down menu in Flutter. Hopefully they clean that up, or we come up with a package that shortens that process. But this is a drop-down list with imperial and metric. And we can see it's on the screen here. It does not look the way we want it to. So up above children, let's do a main axis alignment and a main axis alignment of space between, just like Dave Matthews. And there we go. So we got our label on the left, our units, or our drop down here on the right. It will always go back to imperial because we have imperial hard coded. So don't worry if you're picking metric and not seeing it on the screen. When we hook up the provider, that will fix that. Let's wrap the row with some padding. And instead of all, I'm going to do symmetrical, horizontal, and 15.0. There, that pushes them out there. And actually, above the padding, I'm just going to put a sized box of height, 25.0, just to create a little bit of space off the top here. So that pushes it down. Good. All right, so there's our first row. The next row, we want to create some filter chips. And so let's find the bottom of this padding, add a column, and there we want another row. We want children in that row. And just like above, we want a label. So let's do a text that says wax lines. And then next, let's do a row of filter chips. So I'm going to do a container. And I'm going to give the container a child. And in the child, we're going to do a wrap widget. And a wrap widget allows its children to wrap, which is kind of obvious once you figure it out. But it also allows you to specify the spacing. So this spacing property is the main axis. So we're going to go left to right. So that's the space left and right. Let's just do 5. And run spacing, we'll do 5.0. That is the cross-axis alignment. So we are probably not going to wrap with just 2 filter chips, but if we did, we'd have a 5.0 spacing between the rows. And this takes children as well. And so I'm going to have 2 children that are filter chips. So let's do filter chip. Let's give it a label, and that's a widget, a text widget, and this one will be the Swix option. Like I said, I'm not going to do a ton of style here, but I would actually like to just add some text style to this. So let's do style, text style, and I'm just going to add the color, which is the theme.ofContext.accent color. So that'll give it that orange color. I got outside here, so this needs to be inside the text. All right, and the selected, for now, we're just going to say false. And then we need a onSelected method. So I'm just going to put something blank here. Inside the value here, we do need to put Boolean value. And let me leave that there so you can stretch that a little bit so you can see it all. So we've got our filter chip. It's got a label. We styled the label a little bit. We have to select whether it's selected. We put false for now. That's just a hard-coded value, which we will come back to. And onSelected, we're going to get a Boolean value, which is true or false. And I'm going to put another to do here. And I'm just going to leave it as to do. But basically, when that is checked, we need to interact with our provider and set that in our state. All right, I'm going to format that, and then I'm going to take this filter chip, and I'm just going to copy it. So I'm going to put a comma below it, and to get our second filter chip, I'm just going to copy this whole thing, paste it down below, and replace Swix with Toco, which is another kind of wax. And I'm just going to put true for the hard-coded, just so we can start to see what true and false chipped values look like. And here they are, so we need to space this a little bit. So let's come up here, wrap our row with some padding, and let's do the same thing we did above and just do symmetrical horizontal 25.0. Did I do 25.0? 15.0, excuse me. There we go. And then in our row above the children, let's do a main axis alignment and a main axis alignment of space between. So there we go. I might want to just come up above this padding here and just put a little bit of a sized box just to create a little bit of, say, like 10, a height of 10. Yeah, that just creates a little bit of a visual space there. And you can click these and they're not going to do a darn thing because they're not hooked to any kind of a data source yet. Okay, that is our front end. So let's add a provider in here and make this start to connect with a data source. So in our main widget, at the very top, we want to wrap the material app with a provider. And so if we go back to our diagram, we want the provider to wrap around. That is not the right diagram. There we go. We want this provider to be above my app so that anything below that widget can come up the tree, hit the provider, slide over to the settings class, and get the values that they need for the wax lines or the units. So we want to wrap the material app, and we want to do Change Notifier Provider, which will need to be imported. So we get the provider package brought in. And this has a required property, which is create. And this is where you create your instance of your provider. And we don't have one yet. So we can just we can do our build context. We can do an arrow function, add provider here. Okay. So let's create that provider so we can hook this in here. So let's come over here to lib and let's do a new folder. And this is where we're going to create our providers folder. And inside the providers folder, we are going to have what we're going to call a settings provider. So settings underscore provider.dart. And this is a class. Not a whole lot that's special with this class, except for this part where you say with change notifier. And you will need to import that. You'll notice, nope, sorry. Let's do not change notifier provider, just change notifier. So this one here. There we go. So it actually brought in the provider package on that wrong import, but the correct import is actually material.dart. Change notifier is part of the main Flutter package. It's not special to the provider. The provider package knows how to listen to and to respond to change notifier. And we're using with because this is a mix-in. So there is a change notifier class that contains methods that we want to use. And we will be able to do that and mix that class's methods, functions in with our settings provider class. So it's kind of like extends, except you're not overriding anything. You're just able to use any of the functions or properties that are in that class that you mix in with. So this is going to wind up being our state. And so we want to have a string in here. A private string that is our unit's string. So this is gonna store whether they have selected imperial or metric. And then we're gonna want a list of strings that will tell us the product lines or the wax lines that they have selected. So we'll do underscore wax lines. And these are private because these variables, we want to control access to them. These are private variables within this single instance of this class. We don't want anybody to be able to reach in from the outside and change them without coming through this class. I'd like to give these some default values to get started. So let's do a constructor for settings provider, and let's set units to imperial. Nope. Semicolon there. And let's set the wax lines equal to, we'll just set them both active. Okay. So when we boot up the app, we're in imperial. We've got Swix and Toco wax lines displayed and set in our settings. So let's do a couple getters. So this is how we want people to get these values from these getters. So these will be public, and we will have a string. We'll do a get, and we'll call it units, and it will return our private variable. So that's all there is to that one. We'll do the same thing, but a type of list string. We'll do a get, and we'll call this wax lines without the underscore, so it's accessible, and that will return our wax lines. All right, less critical that people are getting these private variables, but super critical on the set part. So let's do some setters here. So we'll create a void, and we will set our units. So set units. People will be able to pass in a string, which will be a units, and we will set our private variable equal to what they pass in. Now, that doesn't make any sense yet until we do this part. Notify listeners. When we say notify listeners, this is the part that we specify. This is going to communicate over to the widget tree. Wrong diagram again. There we go. When we do that, this is going to communicate over to the widget tree. This value changed, and it's going to go shooting on down here, and anybody who has subscribed to that value in the widget tree will get the update. If you do not do notify listeners, nothing happens, and it's very frustrating. It might take you a long time to figure out why, but notify listeners is absolutely critical. All right. And if anybody were to access these private variables from the outside and update them in their widget, nothing would happen. That's why we want people coming through this set units field. And let's do the same thing with set waxes. And I'm going to make this one private, and I'll show you why in a minute. So this is going to be a list of string wax lines. And this is going to, we want to set the private wax lines equal to what is passed in. And we want to notify our listeners so that widget tree is aware. So the reason I made this private is this is something that we only want to do here. So we want to set, if we want to set our wax lines, the entire wax line, Swix, Toco, we want to be able to do that in our provider here. We don't want somebody doing that from the outside. What they're going to be doing in the widgets here is they're going to be clicking Swix or they're going to be clicking Toco. So actually what we want to be able to do is to add a line when they click one of them and to take it away when they click it again. That's the publicly available part of our function that we want to be able to use. So that's why I made set wax lines private. We will use it and it will make sense then. But for now, let's also give ourselves a way of when people click one of these companies, we just add it to the list of strings. And then when they click it again, we take it out, but leave all the other companies that are in there. All right, so we want to avoid that. We'll add a wax line, and we'll get a string, and it will be a wax line. All right, and so what this is going to do, we're going to say if the wax lines contains the wax line equals false, then we'll do a function. So is that company already in the list? And if so, we're not going to do anything. But if it isn't, we want to add it. So if it isn't, waxlines.add wax line. And then notify our listeners that it's now in the array. We'll do remove wax line, and pretty much the same thing. We do this here. We want to check. So if wax lines dot contains the wax line that's being specified, but in here we want equals to true. So in other words, we want to make sure it's in there before we try to remove it. And if it is, wax lines dot remove, and we can just pass it the wax line, and it will figure out how to get it out of there. And of course, never, ever, ever forget, notify listeners. Okay, so there is a provider if we go to main.dart now, we have a provider that we can create an instance of. So it's a settings provider. Good. And it imported, I've had a lot of trouble with the providers not auto importing. So if you have trouble with that, you just need to come up and do the old fashioned manual import where you go to providers and get it. There we go. If I could even remember how to do it. It's been so long. All right. All right, so there's the instance of our settings provider. So now we have connected our widget tree to our data class. So now we just need to update our widget tree to be able to read those values. So if we come over here to settings.dart, we go to screens, we go to settings.dart, our provider has just about everything we need to do. We need to update the units here. We need to get rid of this hard-coded and figured out what's in the provider that we can use for a value. So we just need to bring in that provider, and we should really have everything that we need. So we can do that up here in the build. We can set a variable of settings provider, and we can bring it in by provider, which needs to be imported .of context semicolon. That's a dynamic, so we come to after of, and we want to specify that we want a settings provider, and we'll need to import that. And so this is what I was talking about. It doesn't have any idea what that is, so I'm coming up here, I'm doing an import. I'm going to providers, I'm going to settings provider. I don't know why that is. It's something to do with providers. Can't seem to find them for the auto import, which is ironic because that's what a provider does. It finds it finds inherited widgets in the widget tree, but can't Visual Studio Code can't follow. So, but anyway, now we have the settings provider. So rather than hard code this value, let's just start getting rid of all this stuff here. Let's do settings provider, and when we hit dot, we've got access to every public property and method. So there we want units. When we select a unit, we want to set the unit. So settings provider, set units, and we will set it to the value of the dropdown. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to go to settings, and if we select metric now, it should stick. There we go. Okay, so that's going back to our provider when we select it, and then the display on this dropdown is coming from our provider as well. Great, so let's hook in the filter chips. Which are a tad more complicated. So we'll come down here to our first filter chip. And so the first thing we need to change is we have hard-coded whether this is selected or not. And so we need an expression. We can get our settings provider.waxLine, and we want to see if that contains Swix. And if it does, then we want to set that to true, and if it does not, we want to set it to false. So if we save that, we should probably see this Swix light up right away because we default set that to Swix and Toco, and we do. And on selected, so if our value, we're going to get a Boolean, whether it's checked or not, if our value is equal to true, in that case, we want to add Swix to the settings line. So settings provider.add wax line. This is the function that we set up, and we want to add Swix. And else, we'll set an else statement. So if it's false, then we want to go to our settings provider and call our remove wax line, and we want to take out Swix. Okay, so down below is the same thing except for Toco. So I'm going to come up here to selected. I'm going to copy this whole line, and I'm going to wipe out the true on selected and replace Swix with Toco. And then I'm going to do the same thing in the on selected. I'm going to take the whole if else statement, put it right here, and change the Swix to Toco there, Swix to Toco there. All right, and so we should be able to uncheck Swix, Toco, change Imperial, everything sticks. And so there we are. We have a working provider that interacts. We can set things on the screen. They will go to the provider. The provider will feed it back up the widget tree, and we will get these values that we can then display. If you destroy the state, however, and you go back in here, everything is gone. So for me, I consider this kind of a hollow example unless we actually take care of that, because you're going to be using Change Notifier Provider in circumstances where you need to be storing this information. I don't know of too many apps where you need to just kind of store the state like this and then not have it have any kind of long-term storage. Most of what I deal with, there's what goes on the screen, but everything is basically being mirrored to a database so that if the screen goes away or the user leaves the app and they come back, everything's supposed to just pick up where it left off, and we go from there. So I think to make this a complete example, we really need to come up with a way to offload this state to a database and then get it back in. And so I'm going to use shared preferences for that. And shared preferences is just a key value pairing on your device. So we can take, if we set this to metric, we can store on our device a key with the tag units and the value that they have picked on this screen. So when we lose state, we can get it back. So let's do that in our settings provider. And what we want in here is a way to save the preferences and to basically load them. So to get them in and out of that database. So let's do a save preferences. And it's going to need to be async because that's the way shared preferences works. And we'll bring in shared preferences. We'll do shared preferences. We'll create a variable called prefs, and we'll set that equal to await shared preferences dot get instance. And to set a string, all we need to do is take our instance prefs dot set, and you can only store primitive values in shared preferences, but that works just fine for us. We need to come up with a key, and we need to pass it a value. So for key, I'm just going to use units. And for the value, I'm going to give it underscore units. And for our wax lines, we want to set string list. And we'll call that our wax lines. And we will pass it our private variable wax lines. So that gives us the ability to save all of the variables that we have in our settings provider to shared preferences. Let's also get them. So let's do a load preferences. That's also going to be async. We need to bring this into, I'm going to copy this line. You need to get an instance of shared preferences. And we're going to want to get a string from it. So we'll call that string units is going to be equal to prefs.get string. And we just pass it the key. So it's going to get us whatever string it's got in its storage that has the key, which is what we passed in here. So we'll get our units back. And then we will want a list of strings. That will be our wax lines. And that will be equal to prefs.get string list, and the key is wax lines. And so if there's nothing on your device, so the very first time we do this, if we haven't saved preferences, you get null back. And so we don't want to set it to null. So if units does not equal null, then we'll call set units. And same thing here, if wax lines is not equal to null, then we will set our wax lines to that value. So this is where we're going to use that underscore. This is where we would want to just set the whole wax line instead of one company in and out individually. And we only want to be able to do that from our provider. So that's why we made this private up here so that it can't be accessed from the widget, just inside the provider. Okay, so when we fire this up and we get our constructor constructing up here, we've set some default values, which is fine. But once we load our default values, we want to go to load preferences, search our device, and find out if we have saved anything there and replace those. And if we hit load preferences, it'll do that. Now, saving our preferences, we want to do that everywhere we notify listeners, except for this internal set wax line. All right, let's change this to metric. Let's change it to Toco only. And now we will reset the state. And you can see that we have saved those values to our device. And when we wipe out the state, when it is rebuilt, when our come back here, when our instance of setting provider is rebuilt, when all of this has to be rebuilt, it will trigger the constructor. The constructor will go to, first it will load these default values, so there's something for that split second on the screen. Then it will go to load preferences, and it will get out of the stored values on the device the values that we want, pass them to our set units and our set wax lines, and we can go from there. Now, if I were continuing on with this app, I would keep save preferences, I would keep load preferences, but I would take the actual shared preference load and save, and I would move that to a service. And these providers here, these are your jumping off points for your data. So any database that is non-reactive, so if you're dealing with shared preferences in this case, if you're dealing with SQLLite, if you're dealing with an API, the Change Notifier Provider is great because as the widgets are interacted with and events are created, we can create methods here like set units that allow us to set the value, keep the state. We notify the listeners on the screen. But then we can also work in a call to take care of the data part of the storage. So when we set the units, yeah, we notify the screen, we notify the listeners, and the widgets all update on the screen, which is great. But this is also a hook for us to be able to say, all right, let's go to our database and let's save this where we need to so that when the app is done and we refire it up, we can reverse that process and bring the app state right up to where it was when we left off. Great, so I'm going to wrap it up there. This has been Change Notifier Provider. Hopefully you found this helpful. We're going to continue this series and start to look at some of the other providers in the provider package with the same app. So some of the boilerplate we typed today, you're not going to have to retype, so that's a good thing. So if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, and hopefully we will see you next time.